Hi, hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Joe Louis Greenway Neighborhood Planning Study Virtual Meeting Series. This evening is the third meeting in our five-meeting series. Tonight we'll be focused on industry and jobs. And so as you all enter, please put your name and neighborhood in the chat so that we know where our residents are viewing from. Right. By the way, my name is Joseph Kemp, Community Engagement Manager for the Joe Louis Greenway Neighborhood Planning Study. I want to thank you guys for being here this evening with us. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the planning study tonight. We also are going to talk about what we've heard from community input, what we found through the data analysis that we've been conducting, also talk about the draft strategies and ideas and get some feedback from you all in that question and open discussion section. And then we'll talk about next steps because we do have a couple more meetings left in the series. And so the Greenway itself is a recreational path that would traverse the city, crossing multiple neighborhoods, unifying communities, and green spaces. We want to be intentional about creating equitable spaces through art, programming, and economic opportunities for all Detroiters. When the weather permits, please go enjoy the trailhead that's pictured here. It's at the West Warren Gateway at the specific address. It's on West Warren, right at the Dearborn border. And so this shows you everyone that's currently working on the planning study. It's led by the City Planning and Development Department. We also have been collaborating across departments as well. And then we have a consultant team that we brought on, Interface Studio, that brings a wealth of knowledge both locally and nationally on community development projects very similar to the Joe Louis Greenway. And also focused on the present and future of the Greenway, the Joe Louis Greenway Partnership is a nonprofit that was formed to ensure the Joe Louis Greenway is a space that benefits Detroit neighborhoods in an equitable way. With Executive Director Leona Metley at the helm, the organization is focused on the future programming of the Greenway and the community engagement that will lead to further community development. And so this process was built off of the model from the original framework, which incorporated a Citizens Advisory Council. We created our own called the Community Leadership Team. And these individuals have are residents of the neighborhoods around the Greenway, and they're tapped into their social networks as well as have been a huge help with community engagement and reviewing draft materials. Through this group of people, we are able to examine more place-based strategies and also gauge if we're going in the right direction. And so the Joe Louis Greenway Framework Plan, released in 2021, laid the foundation for the work that we're doing now. The major goals from that plan are to enhance the quality of life and promote community development, promote equity, and improve the transportation network within the city. And if you look across the bottom, there's a band that says inclusive growth strategy, housing affordability, wealth creation, create jobs, and sustain and grow business. And so you'll see some of those same themes that occur throughout the planning study as well. And so while we're conducting analysis and community engagement locally, we have also been looking nationwide at how Greenway projects have affected other cities. Greenways have been shown to attract activity and stimulate local businesses, which in turn can create jobs. We don't know exactly how or when the JOG will impact the neighborhoods it touches, but through this study, we're able to have an opportunity to better evaluate and plan for the potential economic impacts with community. And so while the initial framework focused on these goals for the Greenway itself, The neighborhood planning study is about making investments, making sure the investments of the Greenway benefit the neighboring communities. We're developing strategies through analysis and community engagement affecting these emerging topics. And so you see some of the same themes that occurred within that original framework occurring within the planning study. So creating jobs and sustaining business, organizational capacity, housing affordability, neighborhood improvements, building wealth, and also connectivity and mobility. Tonight, our focus is on industry and jobs. And so this slide is our overall timeline. Last year, we began our community engagement process with meetings in all of the planning areas around the city on the within the route of the JLG. The community leadership team then hosted small group meetings. We also followed up with a vacant land summit that was well attended and a series of neighborhood walks that we entitled Move and Talks that gave residents space to talk about current neighborhood conditions and priorities for the community's future. Now we are at meeting 3 of the virtual meeting series. We're also returning to in-person meetings in the spring to have meetings to talk about and gather further feedback on these things before our summer celebration. We wanted to be intentional about our process, making sure all materials and information is accessible to residents. The size and scope of this project gives us an opportunity to talk about these things with a broad range of the population. And so we've taken all of the things that we've heard from those engagements and formed draft strategies. And so tonight we're delving into the ideas about industry and jobs. As you're listening to the presentation, please think about the strategies being presented and how they might apply to your neighborhood and the section of the Joe Louis Greenway that's closest to you. Are there any strategies that you would like to change? Do you have concerns about anything? Is the team heading in the right direction? Is there an idea that excites you? And are there any ideas that the planning team is missing that relates to industry and jobs that you would like to see? We're really looking for feedback so we can start applying these strategies to each planning area this spring. After this short presentation tonight, we'll have a questions and a discussion session where we'll be able to answer any questions and talk about these strategies a little bit further. If you have any questions along the way while we're doing the presentation, you can always drop those questions or comments in the chat, and then we'll get back to those once we get around to the questions and open discussion portion of the evening. And so I'm going to pass it over to Ashley, that's going to talk from Interface Studios, that's going to talk about the key questions that we'll be examining tonight.
Thanks, Joseph, and hello, everybody. I want to give a special shout out to those of you who may be participating in all of these meetings. As Joseph said, we are doing this topical series, and so this is the 3rd of 5 meetings. So special thank you to those of you if you have attended previous meetings in this series. But tonight we're really here to talk about industry and industrial jobs and industrial land in particular. And so, as we're thinking about how to frame this work, these are really the key questions we're trying to answer with some of this analysis and some of these draft ideas. First is, where do we double down on industrial districts alongside the Greenway? Where should they expand? Where do we preserve them? Are there places that we want to, move away from potential industrial uses in the future? Second is, how do we mitigate the impacts of industry along the Greenway and along neighboring residents? We also really want to think about zoning in particular and where zoning changes might be needed. For future industrial districts, what kinds of industry is compatible within a neighborhood context? We also want to really think about how we jumpstart the turnover of underutilized industrial properties to maybe higher quality industrial sites or sites that can provide more high quality jobs to residents. And we also in the long term really want to think about attracting new employers and what that might look like alongside the JLG and how neighboring residents can really benefit from those future jobs. Go to the next slide. First, I kind of wanted to frame this in that crazy graph that Joseph presented, that we have done a couple rounds of engagement at this point, and we've had a lot of different kinds of conversations, both with residents on the ground and in larger public settings. One is that, as we're thinking about this industrial space, we've heard a lot that Detroit is a city of makers and that there's a real pride in that spirit. So we do see an opportunity along the JLG to really continue that legacy of Detroit and celebrate that spirit of makers. We also heard a lot of negative perceptions of industry, that those perceptions are really deep rooted and will be a challenge to overcome when we think about future industry along the JLG. We also heard that the impacts from industry are still being felt today, including things like truck traffic. We heard a lot about dust and noise and those impacts of trucks along different neighborhoods. And then also sometimes the physical appearance of those industrial properties are taking away from potential experiences along the Joe Louis Greenway and concerns about air pollution. We also heard about the messaging around industry that maybe they're always centered around job creation. Sometimes those messages maybe don't come to fruition. We heard a little bit that the messaging around jobs is a little bit tired. We hear the promise of jobs often, but it can take a really long time for those to come to pass. And so how do we really think about what it really means to message industry and what does modern industry mean for these neighborhoods? And let's be honest about how long that might take. And lastly, in particularly thinking about our conversations in the Southwest, there's been a lot of advocacy and engagement around what it means to have industrial spaces in those nearby neighborhoods. And some of that advocacy has been really effective in terms of mitigating truck traffic in that neighborhood, really thinking about improving design standards and buffering standards, and where the city is looking to provide additional tree plantings, particularly in Delray. Let's go to the next slide. So I just wanted to start off by doing a little bit of very general framing about industrial land in the city. So where is industrial land located and why? Historically, industrial land was located close to sources of easy transportation routes along rail lines and waterways, and in close proximity to customers and a labor force. So that ended up in urban areas like Detroit. It's also no surprise then that the Joe Louis Greenway, much of it being constructed on a former Conrail line, that a lot of that land surrounding the Greenway is now industrial or vacant, but formerly industrial. So we're dealing with a lot of land along the Greenway that is now industrial. And when thinking about the future of this industrial land or what opportunities there might be, we really need to consider what the stock that we have is, whether it's suited for modern industry, why it's been sitting vacant for a long time. Back in the day, industry was more multi-story buildings and really alongside these rail lines are rail oriented, and they contained a lot of uses. But real modern industry favors larger single-story buildings and single uses. So if you think about your modern Amazon warehouse, for example, those building typologies are very different than the older building stock that you have today. And I also want to talk about why we still need local industrial land, just harkening back to some of those conversations that we had with communities and like, why do we still need this? It's really important to briefly touch on that. If you think about your lunch today, you may have bought it in a commercial retail establishment, but much of those root ingredients were made possible by industry and industrial land. It includes manufacturing, transportation, food processing, even the paper cups, the packaging design, utilities, all of those things. You need industrial land and local industrial land to support those other kinds of things. Also, we do want to note that when you have more industrial land and industrial jobs, that typically those do provide higher wages than those commercial jobs. Let's go to the next slide. So in addition to helping get your lunch on the table, we need industrial land to help maintain a resilient economy, to create opportunities for entrepreneurship and new investment, to support those better paying jobs, and also really think about building local wealth, less importing of goods, those kinds of things. We also need to consider holding on to industrial land because generally speaking, the supply of industrial land won't increase. So it's very rare for a city to create new industrial zones of land. You really have to work within your bounds. And if you keep chipping away at it, eventually you won't have enough to support the kinds of jobs that you would like to see in your community. Go to the next slide. And just in terms of the land side of the equation, we spent a good amount of time looking at the industrial sector and land along the Greenway itself. Just within a half mile of the Greenway, there's almost 70,000 jobs. It does include a lot of the downtown piece there, but 13,000 of those are primary sector jobs or more so industrial jobs. There are over 700 industrial buildings just within our kind of half mile distance from the Greenway. And on those, we found that there are about 50 industrial opportunity sites, or ones that we think could be are underutilized or have opportunities on them for new industry. And that covers about 500 acres of land. So we do think that there's a lot of opportunity sites to think about and how to prioritize those and where we need to be strategic about future industrial development and jobs and all of those things. And just diving a little bit deeper into the parcel data, because I think it's really interesting. You know, we have all of this industrial land. Most of the industrial land along the Greenway is currently zoned for heavy industry. So everything you see on that map in the dark purple is an M4 zoning, which means it can allow a lot of different kinds of industry and a lot of heavy industrial uses. But if we cut that data by looking at the parcels and what they're actually being used as, a lot of this industrial land that's zoned for this heavy industry isn't being used for industry at all. So 49% of the industrial land that you have here isn't even being used for industry currently. Let's go to the next slide. And then also understanding, you know, getting our bearings of what this industrial market looks like, we need to understand the size of these industrial sites. As I mentioned before, modern industry or modern industrial development typically requires very large sites. But a lot of the acreage we're seeing in this particular area of the city, the industrial sites are a lot smaller. That can really limit the types of industrial developers that would be looking for a new site, and explain why some of these industrial sites can sit vacant for so long. So in the next slide. And then in terms of the challenges of industrial land, much of the existing stock that you have is either too small, as I just mentioned, could be obsolete, maybe it has older buildings on it. Many of the sites that we observed are underutilized, meaning if you look at this picture here, it's a really big site with a really small building and maybe not producing a lot of jobs for that amount of acreage. So we would just kind of flag those as potentially underutilized. We also need to consider, in terms of challenges, soil contamination or dirty sites. And it's a lot of money to clean up some of these things and bring them back to a more productive use. We need to consider those impacts from trucks and really look at truck routes and be very strategic on, you know, which of these sites are close to highway interchanges or places where, you know, you're not routing trucks through residential neighborhoods in particular. So really being thoughtful about the truck piece and the distribution piece of things. And then we also really do need to acknowledge the impacts of air pollution and emissions and where we might need more buffering and more trees and more mitigation from those kinds of impacts on neighboring communities. And then just continuing on that challenges theme, this graph shows you the age of the existing industrial building stock throughout all of the areas and sub areas of the Greenway. This is one of those graphs where you need to use a squint test. And what those blue areas are telling you is that most of the industrial buildings that you have are older. So the 40s and the 50s there in the middle. And this means that users must be really able to either use the building stock that you have, or your business must be profitable enough to cover the cost of a new building. And so there's a really big gap in terms of smaller businesses being able to afford the kinds of spaces that are more modern that can really help them get off the ground. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to also note that considering some of those industrial conflicts along the Greenway, these kinds of spaces can really create some barriers along access routes to the Greenway. This top photo is from Prairie in the Northwest. So the trail, if you're standing in the middle of this road, the trail is right behind you. And so if you're driving through these industrial districts, that really might impact your experience of getting to the Greenway. And so we need to think about, are these industrial districts creating barriers in the look and the feel? Are they welcoming enough to have residents want to travel through them to get to the Greenway itself, or are they creating barriers? And then I also wanted to note that we did hear, the truck part of the equation, and we even witnessed that during our move-in talks. That lower picture I took when we were out in the Northeast, one, we observed truck parking and trucks parked on the Greenway itself. And so we do hear you loud and clear that the truck part of this equation really does need special consideration and thinking throughout this work. And then in terms of the industrial market findings summary, so we took all of that information. I will say that we have a whole other consultant or team really thinking about the industrial market and what's possible in terms of industrial development. Erin Kenny is on the line tonight. If you have any questions about that specific piece of the puzzle, she'd be happy to answer them. But largely, this is a very simplified version. Largely, the study recommends transitioning away from heavy industrial uses, so those dark purple M4 areas that I showed you before, except in very strategic places, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. We also want to make sure in other areas that we are still providing land for jobs, but maybe an industrial mix of uses. And this can really include new industrial real estate types. So how are we complementing the existing conditions in co-location with commercial and housing and all of the Greenway uses? What does modern industry look like through that lens, and what is compatible with what's alongside the Greenway? The third piece here is really important because what our market analysts found is that the natural private sector market will not produce the industrial landscape that you're capable of. And they really highlighted the need for the public sector to push that market. So basically what they said was there's resources for small scale commercial and large scale industrial development in terms of funding and financing and all of those things. But what's really missing is the middle small industrial scale funds. And I'm going to talk about an idea for how we might approach that in a minute. And then lastly, in line with what we were hearing out on the road and our engagement takeaways, there's a real need to address the negative perceptions and impacts of existing industrial uses on the Greenway and the surrounding homes. Okay, so what does that all mean? We're going to transition now into talking about our goals and strategies from everything that we learned. How can we be responsive to the market findings and looking at the land that we have available and really supporting these goals. So these goals were formed from both that study and then also the framework study that Joseph lifted up before. But really, we're thinking about 4 things here, making sure that we're supporting existing businesses and connecting businesses to the Greenway itself. Second, we really want to make sure we're creating new jobs off the Greenway where possible in the short and long term. We want to really think about reducing impacts on surrounding residences and the JLG. And lastly, we really want to make sure we're working to connect residents to jobs. So I think Joseph's going to open up a quick poll here. If you can answer, it's hard to pit these against one another, and we shouldn't see it as that, but if one of these goals is most important to you, we'd love to hear from you. Give that one more minute. It looks like the last piece, connecting residents to jobs, might be resonating the most with folks on the call. Great. All right. So now I'm going to just jump into the strategies that are supporting to achieve these goals. Okay, and I'm going to go through each of these in the following slides, so I'm not going to read them all right now, just because we're going to get in a little bit deeper. But I will say that each of these strategies really are helping to achieve some of these larger goals in the plan. Let's just jump to the first one. If you want to go to the next slide. So the first piece is really thinking about supporting existing businesses and the vision of the Greenway and connecting major employers to the Greenway itself. So when it comes to industrial business support, we're really leaning on the mobility recommendations that we presented 2 nights ago, where we want to create better connections from industrial employers to the Joe Louis Greenway. So this map is really just looking at the west side and zooming in on that area. Again, one of those squint tests where if you look at the red dots, those are showing you the amount of jobs or at those particular places. But from that, we can see, where we need better connections to major employers along the Greenway, and really need to think about how we can encourage employees to use these routes as much as possible. We want to make sure that those connections are really safe and welcoming. To the next slide. Okay, for creating new jobs off the Greenway, the market study pointing to the DeQuinder Cut extension as the best place to double down on industry. That's really building off the energy of all of the work that's going on in the Eastern market and the existing industrial businesses that are there. It's really important to underscore that better defining what uses are appropriate here and how to lift up addressing the negative impacts that residents are feeling nearby fall into place here. So how can we create an industrial blight to beauty program here to reduce the negative impacts on this industrial land? Where can we plant more trees and buffer these uses from the Greenway and nearby neighborhoods? And lastly, making sure we're really thinking about truck route planning and lessening the amount of truck traffic on smaller residential streets. And then in the longer term in this area, in this DeQuinder Cut extension area, we really want to think about expanding the amount of industrial jobs here and what that might look like and how we can attract better industrial employers. So this means acquiring and improving industrial opportunity sites. Some of them might be underutilized, that picture before. We want to make sure we're maximizing the potential here and really thinking long-term about this district. And again, this is maybe longer term to acquire these types of properties or make them suited for more modern industrial development. But it's really because you need to think about, what it takes to stitch those things together, cleaning them and then readying them for development. But we really do see the opportunity here. So this is kind of the long-term vision of thinking about this area as a place to really think about expanding industrial opportunities. We go to the next slide. This is really in line with, okay, so we are thinking about, a long-term industrial district here, making sure that that is addressing the needs of the community and making sure that those properties are adding to the character of the community and as green as possible. And I just wanted to point that for including industrial design guidelines for industrial properties along the Greenway, the city released industrial design guidelines in 2022 to really raise the bar of the design of industrial properties across the city. We are exploring the potential to clarify specifically what happens if your industrial property fronts the Greenway. So are there special considerations we need to think about for new industrial properties that set up shop along the Greenway in this area? What should they look like? Do they have some special buffering that we need to consider? Those kinds of things as we think about what it means to do to industrial development on the Greenway in the future. And then within that, kind of on the same line, in reducing the impacts on surrounding residences in the JLG, before we talked about doubling down on the DeQuinder Cut, but for the remainder of the industrial land along the Joe Louis Greenway in our planning areas, we're really studying the opportunities to downzone from that heavy industrial dark purple to either a lighter purple or a mix of uses. So from N4 to light industrial, we still think that industrial uses will be permitted in most cases, but to less intensive uses, or a mix of commercial industrial uses. We also want to make sure, in order to reduce the impacts on surrounding communities, we're really thinking about what a small to mid-sized industrial development program looks like, that we can really support those smaller spaces, modern light industrial spaces for makers and businesses. We want to incentivize property owners to meet updated industrial design guidelines. And again, in these areas, since there still be industrial or a mix of uses, we'll still also being mindful to address the negative impacts of existing industrial uses on the Greenway. So bringing in those industrial blight to beauty ideas or strategic tree plantings and bufferings, and really thinking through the truck route planning piece. Let's go to the next slide. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into that idea of the missing middle for entrepreneurs and the kinds of industry that you might be able to attract to these proposed lighter industrial districts along the JLG. We want to support businesses that align with the spirit of the Greenway itself. This includes industrial sectors like makers and entrepreneurs that are looking to scale up. So if they are outgrowing their maker spaces, we call those second stage companies. They may need more room for storage or warehousing, shipping online orders, maybe having a showroom. Those kinds of spaces, the smaller industrial spaces, is really what our market analysts found is missing from the market. So we're really thinking about how we might be able to pilot that along the Joe Louis Greenway in one of these areas. The next slide. This is just kind of sharing a little bit what those kind of modern facilities could look like, both from the inside and the outside. They're typically flexible, subdividable spaces so that you'd be able to maybe get a smaller space at first and scale up if your business is growing. So they allow for that scalability. This could work with a range of different site sizes across the Joe Louis Greenway, and we think it's a great opportunity to pilot somewhere on the Greenway. And more specifically, if we're just, again, zooming into one of our areas as an example, we think that there's something like this in the areas in the Northwest where we might have that opportunity to build a light industrial attraction strategy. So for opportunity sites that are currently vacant or underutilized, we think that this is a really great place to think about what type of this flexible space could be or look like along the JLG and pilot something like that here. Again, this is just an idea, and we're looking at other sites along the Greenway, but there might be some opportunities along vacant land along the Greenway. Let's go to the next slide. And then I also just wanted to lift up the Southwest a little bit, because we did have some really deep conversations about the industrial impacts, in particular in this area. It's just another one of those areas where we're studying the potential to transition away from heavy industrial M4 zoning. The yellow area in particular was identified in other studies to transition away from industrial uses entirely. So while some of these might be a little bit longer term, we're all thinking about all of these industrial areas and downzoning them. And in areas where it might take a long time, on the Longyo alignment of the Joe Louis Greenway, right now that's a very heavy industrial use, and in the short term, it's likely to remain that way for some time. But how can we lessen those impacts on the Southwest community? So really thinking about additional trees and buffering and additional screening, those types of things in the short term. And then the last bucket here, which you all voted as most important in your poll, is really thinking about connecting residents to jobs. So in places where we're able to attract new industrial employers, again, maybe more so in the long term, during construction, we want to connect local job seekers to the Joe Louis Greenway contractors, continue to direct outreach and local contractors at trade events, those kinds of things. We really want to leverage training and workforce experience programs. So for future Greenway maintenance and stewardship pilots, how can we build up the workforce and workforce programs around that actual Greenway maintenance and implementation? We also want to make sure we're bringing job fairs to events along the JLG, connecting those available jobs on the Greenway itself while they're standing there. We want to think about ensuring the Greenway itself helps to address transportation barriers, really thinking about existing employers and attracting new ones along the Greenway. And then lastly, in the long term, working with new development and employers to develop job training programs. There are specific programs that the city is building and working on where you can, as new industries are coming in, work with them to say, this is what we as employers need. and training that we need, and how we can match those two things along the Greenway. So really thinking about what new jobs are available and what the gaps might be in terms of skill sets, and how we kind of fill in those gaps to make sure local residents can get hired by these new jobs. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to facilitate our Q&A. I'll also ask Michelle if there's anything I missed on that last slide from the city's perspective. I'm happy to maybe fill out that conversation a little bit more.
Thanks, Ashley. That's perfect. And that was great to see that being such a priority. If you do have a question, you can use the raise hand function within the reactions button, or you can put your question in the chat. We do have a couple folks here from Detroit at Work, and they really, everything on that last slide about the job trainings, the work experience programs, the centers, the Detroit at Work centers that are available. There's a huge amount of information about existing programs on their website, and we're working closely with them to see what that can mean for the Greenway itself. I'm looking to see if there are any questions. Give it another minute or so. We can always go back to them. Okay. If you thought about incorporating local farms to the Greenway, that's an interesting question. I think we have not heard that coming out of any of the neighborhood specific engagement that we've done so far. Obviously, there's the urban ag ordinance, and there's definitely a concerted effort with the new director of urban ag within the city to support our local farms and urban agriculture. So that's something that is definitely, a possibility as we see working with, the demand that's there. One challenge that we would have that I would speak to, and definitely Ashley or others jump in, is that the type of properties that Ashley has just been describing with former industrial land use, they're not going to be immediately compatible with farming activity. That said, I think one thing to lift up is the MKT zoning that's been done around Eastern Market, with a mind specifically to supporting food production and all of the other types of industrial activity around that, really in a place-based strategy. So if you're interested in that, you can look at the Eastern Market Framework Plan. And that's something that we're really looking to as well, to coordinate with partners to see how we can help leverage the Joe Louis Greenway to move that plan forward.
Yeah, I was just pulling up the numbers from our Vacant Land slide deck. Again, a lot of the land along the off-street portions of the Joe Louis Greenway are formerly industrial. And so just within the first block, we have 530 acres of vacant land, and 55% of it is formerly industrial, which means it's most likely too dirty to be into an urban farming use right away. So how do we prioritize sites for that? Where is their interest? Like all of those things we're thinking about in terms of the vacant land strategy. We'll be going to be talking about those ideas and strategies next Thursday, I believe. But it's definitely part of our consideration of how, we can get those lands back to productive use. It's just a little bit extra complicated when the land was formerly industrial.
All right. Let's see. Is it possible to have retail business in the areas? Yes, absolutely. So we kicked off this series of virtual meetings, and they're all recorded and will be posted on the planning website, which is www.detroitmi.gov/JLG planning. And we'll post that at the end of this as well. But if you missed the commercial and small business topic, we went over kind of what the market study, the land use, and the commercial corridor analysis kind of led us to there, specifically related to retail business. So definitely check that out. And as it relates to our industrial lands, I think some of what we're exploring is in these areas where we would be transitioning from heavy industry in terms of the zoning and land use to explore opportunities for downzoning or a mix of commercial and industrial. There's possibilities to have some of these things coexist where, and the example that Ashley spoke to, showed on the screen of that shared industrial space for second stage companies, there are ways to incorporate both that smaller scale second space manufacturing and industrial with a retail component, especially if those businesses are one and the same and able to sell those goods. I'm also happy to, if folks have questions and want to unmute themselves, we can do that. Oops. Are you considering planting fruit trees along the JLG? I think that's a great question, potentially to revisit a little bit more specifically on our last topic meeting next Thursday, which is focused on vacant lands. But again, one of those pieces that we're looking at there is how do we restore potentially former industrial land that, even if the land wasn't industrial, so we see some of the parcels that are really close to the former railway, and making sure that we're restoring that land to be healthy, to be able to plant things like food and fruit trees, and then looking for where there's interest in doing that and where there's community partners, and also what the strategy is for where those types of things go. But what we're doing right now is really trying to put out there the market and land use analysis that we've completed, and then really dive into what the local communities want to see and what the specific interest of developers is, community and neighborhood-based developers.
Question from Jay pop up in the chat, Michelle. What initial recommendations have you received from the community? I can kick that off if you were a little bit late, but we did have we'll call it 2 rounds of engagement previous to this one, and both of those were feeding into all of these different strategies. So I had a summary slide that we can pull back up at the end, but basically there are a lot of concerns about addressing the negative impacts of current industrial sites and how we might be able to mitigate some of those. And then also we talked a lot about downzoning. So there's some maps where I showed that a lot of the current industrial land along the Greenway is zoned for heavy industry. And so if we're thinking about lighter impacts where we're still able to provide jobs to residents, but lessening those impacts, really thinking about transitioning those from heavy industrial sites to light industrial sites. So all of these goals and these strategies were kind of formulated out of that community engagement process. We also have a question that Joseph's going to get to at the end here, is if we're missing any strategies. So if you're thinking about recommendations that you would have liked to see in this particular topic or space, we'd be happy to talk through what those might be too.
All right, so I'm going to share the results from Are We Heading in the Right Direction? Looks like we, for the most part, there's a level 4 that won out. So it looks like we're heading in the right direction, but there's some 2s and 3s, which would be awesome to hear some feedback on what you think we're missing, so we can make sure that we hear everybody and are looking at the industry and jobs from all from all angles.
Yeah, and I also, maybe just to stress, those of you that answered to the 2s or 3s of the last question are kind of wondering, maybe none of these are exciting to you. This really is our space to get feedback on these overall strategies. And so in the next round, we're going to be taking these and really zooming in on the planning areas to see how they apply. So we just wanted to, gauge where we were with these strategies overall, because in the next round, we're going to be looking at how they get applied to those different planning areas. So it's a really good, just like, getting a pulse of what we think we might be missing, what needs to be tweaked before we work to finalize them within the planning areas themselves.
It looks like we have a few answers in the chat. Someone says number 4, which is downzoning, combination of blight to beauty that involves resident gardens. Nice. Number 5, okay. Industrial development programs to support small spaces for makers and businesses. And also preserving heavy industrial, better defining industrial uses and design guidelines that they fit within the communities that they're in. Yes, there's a question about contacting us in the chat. You can definitely reach out to us at joelewisgreenway@detroitmi.gov with any feedback, questions. We definitely do respond to that very frequently. So how are you incentivizing the property owners to meet new guidelines?
I can speak to that a little bit, and then we'll take the question from Renard, raise his hand. So one thing that we're thinking about and that has been piloted through other programs is sometimes there are grant programs or matching programs that are tied to meeting certain design guidelines. So that could be something like a program organized similarly to like a Motor City Match, where you have small businesses that are applying for funds from the city. And what we would envision with that is that it would be tied to making improvements to the business that were in the guidelines of what the aspirations are of site design and facade improvements and things like that. Another example of this is in our strategic neighborhood fund areas, where 10 areas across the city that we've been doing planning work over the last 7 years. We've been able to work with the Strategic Neighborhood Fund for facade grant programs for different business corridors. And so thinking about that in a new way for the Joe Louis Greenway is what is the real need there? And we've seen this need come from resident responses and engagement, as well as from visual survey and things like that, that there really is a need to support these small businesses in the industrial space. And that's something that that could be unique to the Greenway. So these aren't things that exist now, but we wanted to receive feedback about whether this was a priority or how that could work. So I think Renard, you raised your hand. Are you able to unmute?
Yes. Thank you, Michelle. So I know we covered the area of jobs for the Greenway now as it's being built, and I'm responsible for making sure that Detroiters who want to participate in that process of building the Greenway get the proper training so that they can connect with those contractors who are actually building the Greenway currently. The other part of that is I'm thinking ahead, kind of our conversation that we've had is the companies or existing businesses that are around the Greenway now being, and this is on me, I'm just thinking out loud, to be more intentional about connecting with them about opportunities that we can provide from a workforce perspective and connecting Detroiters there, because I know that I haven't had a lot of interaction with those existing companies that are there now. And I know our JET team we can circle back and look at potential companies that will come to the Greenway as a result of the vacant land that's available and opportunities that may be available, but that's their team. But for what I can see, connecting with those existing companies now and what their workforce needs may be, to kind of get a listing of how many jobs are really available for Detroiters. So I would like to work with you and Joseph and just connect with what's existing now.
That sounds great. Thank you, Renard. And just for folks who don't know, Renard is with Detroit at Work, and he is part of the supports that connect job seekers to employers and work with employers, specifically around construction and infrastructure, and has been working with the General Services Department as they're contracting for the construction of the Greenway to think about how that drives jobs. And so thank you, Renard, for kind of connecting that also to the existing industrial business around the Greenway. Okay, I think we've gone through the questions. Joseph, do you want to go ahead and share the results? Do people have their priorities in?
Yes, so I'm going to share the results of the poll. And so it looks like address the negative impacts of the existing uses won out with the long-term planning and down zoning from M4 trailing behind. So very, very interesting results. Great, thank you for responding to that survey. And thank you for coming this evening. And that has been our meeting for industry and jobs. We did have a meeting on the 25th for commercial and small business, and also a meeting about mobility on the 30th. Both of those are available on our website right now, which I'll drop into the chat, detroitmi.gov/JOG planning. You can go watch those presentations at your leisure. And we do have 2 more meetings coming up next week: housing on Tuesday, February 6th, and vacant land on Thursday. And you can always stay tuned for anything that we have coming on our website, detroitmi.gov/JOG planning. And then also, if you want to reach out to us, you can do so at Joe Louis Greenway at detroitmi.gov or 313-279-8248, as well as our social medias, Instagram, J. Louis Greenway, and Facebook, Joe Louis Greenway. We post all advertisements for all of our meetings, upcoming sessions, so that you can stay involved and have your voice and input heard on this. So I do want to thank you again for being with us this evening. This presentation should be up on the website in the next few days, but you can browse those other 2 at your leisure, and then hopefully we'll see you next week for the final 2 meetings of the series. You guys have a great evening, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, everybody.